Under the cold moonlight of ancient Rome, a secret was hidden behind the sturdy city walls and magnificent temples, where the sacred fire was never allowed to extinguish. It was the flame of the Vestal Virgins, the maidens who not only kept the fire but also bore the sacred responsibility of maintaining the city's prosperity and peace. Yet behind that pure and solemn appearance lay a world full of mystery, traps, and harsh rules that could push anyone into earthly hell. As night fell, footsteps echoed through the cold stone corridors of the Temple of Vesta, where the Vestal Virgins resided. These women, young and graceful, embodied purity and spiritual strength in Roman society. Their mission was to keep the sacred fire in the temple forever burning, for it was believed that this flame symbolized the soul of Rome. If it went out, the entire city would fall into unforeseeable disaster. Julia, a girl newly chosen as a Vestal Virgin, still could not believe her fate. In her 20s, Julia was separated from her family, leaving behind a normal life to enter a world of strict rituals and rules. Chastity, purity, and dedication were the words her mentors repeatedly emphasized like an unbreakable vow. But the Vestal Virgins did more than just keep the fire. They were the bridge between the human world and the gods, protecting Rome's prosperity and peace through mysterious religious rites known only to them. Step by step, Julia learned to control every thought and emotion to maintain purity not only of body, but also of soul. Day by day, Julia gradually realized that the burden of purity was not light. A small mistake, a moment of weakness, could lead to a terrible death sentence, being buried alive in a cold underground dungeon. Every Vestal understood that their vow of chastity was not a choice, but a destiny. Any violation was unforgivable. Horrifying stories of Vestals who had broken their vows and were buried alive as a warning constantly haunted them. One shocking case was that of Amelia, a beautiful and noble Vestal who was found guilty of breaking her vow. She was stripped of all privileges, bound, and taken down to a dark prison where life was measured only in minutes. Rome's sacred fire still burned, but within the city was a terrifying ghost, the death of a Vestal Virgin. Julia had heard rumors that there were silent enemies within the temple, identities unknown, always waiting to sabotage the flame and erase Rome's prosperity. Were these mysteries true? Who would protect the sacred fire from invisible forces? The role of the Vestal Virgins was not only sacred, but also powerful. They enjoyed rare privileges, lived in luxurious temples, and were respected equal to the nobility. Roman law even strictly forbade anyone from offending or harming them, as that meant a curse upon the whole city. But it was precisely these rights and status that made the Vestal Virgins targets of dark conspiracies. Julia realized that often the sacred fire was threatened not only by foreign enemies or natural disasters, but also by internal forces, people inside the temple who were not united. Long nights in the shadows, probing glances, whispered words unspoken in the daylight, all formed a web of conspiracy tightly entangling Julia's life. She began to suspect her sisters nearby, wondering who was friend and who was foe. A terrible secret gradually revealed itself. There was a traitor who had extinguished the sacred fire on a fateful night, plunging Rome into chaos. Julia had to quickly find the culprit before tragedy repeated. When the sacred fire went out, the entire city of Rome trembled. Julia, still inexperienced, was assigned the task of restoring the flame. This was not only a test of physical endurance, but also of spirit and purity. Any mistake could condemn her as those Vestals of old. Julia's journey was a battle against darkness, betrayal, and harsh prejudices. She discovered that keeping the sacred fire was also about holding firm to faith, courage, and the will to rise above all. With help from some trusted allies and ancient secrets found in scrolls of papyrus, Julia gradually uncovered the truth about the flame, about the true position of the Vestal Virgins in Rome's history, and about the dark conspiracies behind the glorious facade. The story of Julia and the Vestal Virgins was not only a journey of guarding the sacred flame, but also a tale of inner struggles, secrets never before revealed about power, purity, and survival in an ancient society. The flame of the Vestals was not only the guiding light for Rome, but also the fire within each person, the fire of courage, sacrifice, and a great tradition never extinguished. Beneath the cold shadows of the Temple of Vesta, where the sacred flame has been kept alive for centuries, a vow echoes in Julia's mind. an unbreakable vow of chastity, a commitment tied for life to a sacred mission. It is not merely a promise, but a harsh sacrifice few can truly comprehend, a trial for both body and soul. After recent events, when the sacred flame nearly extinguished because of a betraying hand, Julia now stands on the edge of a decision more difficult than any before. She knows that to protect the city of Rome, to keep the gods ever present, it requires not only courage, but also the complete keeping of the vow of chastity, that the Vestals must obey unconditionally. Through sleepless long nights, Julia lies in the cold room, reflecting on the loneliness that the vow brings. Friends, family, love, all seem distant, like another world beyond her reach. Yet alongside that, she also feels an invisible strength, a sacred connection with the gods, with the destiny of Rome. The story of Aemilia, the beautiful Vestal who failed to keep her vow, still haunts Julia. The price paid for her mistake was not just death, but erasure from history, utter rejection by society. Aemilia was once the pride of the temple, but one moment of weakness made her the enemy of the entire city. Julia does not want that fate. Under the starry sky, Julia realizes the vow of chastity is not just a bond, but the path for her to truly become a bridge between the human world and the divine. Each passing day, she must fight temptations, loneliness, and the fear of isolation. But it is precisely in those trials that she finds new strength, a profound steadfastness. However, the secret does not end there. Julia discovers in ancient scrolls a passage revealing that the vow of chastity not only keeps the Vestal virgins pure in body, but also serves as the key to maintaining divine power for all Rome. One who breaks the vow suffers not only personal punishment, but also brings a terrible curse upon the entire city. One night, while the flame burns brightly, a stranger's shadow appears outside the temple. Julia senses danger clearly. Could this be the one who once nearly extinguished the flame? Or is it a new trial for her? This confrontation will not only decide the fate of the sacred flame, but also test Julia's vow of chastity, her sacrifice, and faith. Julia's story continues as a journey through darkness between personal sacrifice and sacred duty. In a world full of traps and conspiracies, can she hold firm to her vow, keep the flame alive, and protect the soul of Rome from riot and chaos? Or will that vow become a shackle, imprisoning her in a tragedy with no escape? Beneath Rome's gloomy sky, the wind whistles through cold stone columns, mingling with sighs and heavy footsteps of those walking in the night. Darkness not only covers the city, but also envelops the souls of the Vestal virgins, those who guard the sacred flame with a holy mission, but bear a terrible burden. After months of fighting to keep her vow of chastity and protect the sacred flame, Julia now faces a darker secret than she ever imagined, the harsh punishment for those who dare break the vow, being buried alive. Rumors of this punishment cut the air like a cold knife, chilling anyone who hears them. Being buried alive is not just simple death, but a sacred punishment, seen as a way to purify sin and protect the purity of the temple, as well as Rome's endurance. Vestals who sin are not publicly executed, not burned or beheaded like ordinary criminals. Instead, they are confined to a deep underground prison with little water, little food, and no help from outside. Julia has heard terrifying stories about Aemilia, a promising young Vestal condemned for an unclear mistake, only once suspected of breaking the vow. The last scene of Aemilia was a small wooden coffin lowered underground, inside which was an endless dark moment. Her silent cries echoed through cold stone walls, a warning for anyone who dares to toy with the sacred vow. But why is Roman society so harsh? Julia begins to investigate deeper the meaning of this punishment. It is not simply personal revenge or a common punishment, but a complex combination of religion and politics. The chastity vow of the Vestal virgins not only keeps them pure, but also symbolizes purity, divine power, protecting Rome from disaster. When a Vestal sins, it signals a weakening in the bond between the divine and the city, shaking the foundation of society. Thus, burial alive is seen as a way to cleanse the sin without defiling the temple or society with the Vestal's blood. It carries deep symbolism, a silent death to protect purity, holiness, untouchable. It is also the way Roman political leaders maintain power, reinforce faith in the religious system and laws, using fear to keep social order. Julia felt the conflict within her soul, both respect for tradition and horror at that cruelty. She wondered if it was possible to uphold the vow without being crushed by invisible pressures and harsh laws. One night, while Julia was meditating by the sacred fire, her closest friend, Livia, suddenly disappeared without a trace. Rumors spread quickly in the temple. Livia had been found breaking her vow, and her fate would surely be a coffin under the cold earth. Julia panicked, but was also angry. She was determined to uncover the truth behind Livia's mysterious disappearance. The silent investigation led Julia to the deepest layers of power and conspiracy within the temple. She discovered that not everything was as it seemed, that some forces manipulated the strictness of the laws to serve private purposes, unhesitant to sacrifice even their closest colleagues. Amid the whirlpool of betrayal and pain, Julia understood that, to keep the sacred fire, she had to not only uphold the vow of chastity, but also fight to break the chains of unjust laws, to protect not only purity, but also the souls of the Vestal virgins. Julia's story is a vivid testament to the strength and sacrifice of the women who devoted their lives to the sacred vow. They were not only symbols of purity, but also silent warriors in a society full of power, fear, and secrets. Do you dare to step into that world where every vow could become a death sentence? Julia will lead you through cold footsteps, locked doors, and flames that never go out, to explore the mysteries never before revealed about punishment, power, and sacrifice in ancient Roman society. ChatGPT said, "Dense darkness covered Rome, where shadows silently moved through ancient stone streets carrying secrets never revealed." Julia, the brave Vestal virgin, had just endured extreme trials to keep the sacred fire and protect the 1,000-year tradition of the Temple of Vesta. But now, a new event, another horrific punishment of ancient Rome, was gradually unveiling before her eyes: poena cullae, the most unique and terrible death sentence for special criminals, a punishment that makes anyone who hears it shudder in fear. Poena cullae, the punishment designed not only to end the criminal's life, but also to be a brutal spectacle to humiliate and warn the entire society. The criminal would be locked inside a large leather sack called cullis, together with the most terrifying creatures: venomous snakes, fierce dogs, strange monkeys, and a surly rooster. This sack would then be tightly bound and thrown into water or buried alive, making the creatures inside become inescapable agents of death. Julia had heard chilling stories about poena cullae from the temple elders, but never imagined its horror until a new case happened right before her eyes. A man convicted of treason, a crime which, in the eyes of Roman authority, was a betrayal of the city's survival, had to undergo this punishment. Julia was ordered to witness the process as a harsh warning about the power of law and authority. The process began with the prisoner being tightly bound, stripped of freedom, locked inside the sturdy leather sack, where the 4 fierce creatures had been released beforehand. Snakes coiled around his legs, dogs barked and growled, monkeys jumped wildly in the cramped space, and the rooster crowed loudly like a final challenge. The suffocating, panicked, and painful sensation gradually overwhelmed the prisoner's body as he could not escape the dark confinement. Julia witnessed the terrified eyes of the man, screams echoing in the dark space, mixed with the hissing of snakes and growling of dogs. The suffocation came not only from the sealed space, but also from the chaos of animals inside the sack, making everyone shudder in horror. This punishment was not only a sentence for the prisoner, but also a symbol of Rome's absolute power, a terrifying warning to anyone daring to defy the laws. It reflected a seamless combination of religion and politics, where every action was seen as affecting the city's prosperity and safety. Julia felt the terrible power of the law, as well as the utter helplessness and loneliness of the condemned. She wondered if there was any escape for souls tormented under such harsh laws, or if all was merely the inhumane cruelty of a society full of power and fear. Julia's life as a Vestal virgin became even more complicated as she had to both keep the sacred fire and face harsh truths about punishment and power. Could she find a way to change or clarify these laws, or would she become part of this painful and mysterious story? The darkness of the Roman night enveloped everything, hiding terrible secrets that few dared to face. Julia, a Vestal virgin who had witnessed the process of the poena cullae punishment, now felt even more deeply the cruelty yet symbolic meaning of this penalty. Behind the leather sack, imprisoning the offender along with fierce animals, each creature was not only a physical nightmare, but also carried a profound symbolic meaning, reflecting the sin and irredeemable disgrace of the condemned. The snake, the first animal Julia thought of, was not simply a dangerous reptile. In Roman culture, the snake symbolized malice, treachery, and the ever-present danger lurking in the shadows. Locking the snake with the offender was a way to send a message. His crime was a poisonous threat that must be harshly punished, a poison that could spread and destroy the whole society if not cleansed. The dog, a loyal animal but also capable of becoming fierce and betraying, was chosen to represent betrayal, a sin especially hated by Roman society. The prisoner being locked with a fierce dog was a clear warning that betrayal not only harms the individual but also destroys the cohesion of the community. It is unforgivable. The monkey, a creature naturally mischievous and chaotic, represented ignorance, chaos, and loss of control. Being locked in the sack with the offender symbolized the inner turmoil, confusion, and stupidity of the criminal when defying sacred and social laws. It was also a reminder of the consequences when people let themselves fall into spiritual and moral chaos. The rooster, an animal known for crowing at dawn to alert people to awaken, carried special meaning. In this context, the rooster symbolized awakening, a warning to the entire society about the dangers of wrongdoing. Its crow echoed as a call to vigilance, urging everyone to stay alert and not let sin spread. Julia had heard that each animal in the deadly sack was not only a means of torture but also an accusation, a vivid testament to the nature of the offender's crime. The poinacule punishment, therefore, was not just physical torment but also a deeply educational and deterrent spectacle. She began to see a strange connection between these symbols and her own life and challenges. As betrayal she once suspected in the temple, the chaos she faced within her soul, and the call to awaken she carried to keep the sacred flame from ever going out. One night, in a dream, Julia saw herself trapped in the leather sack, surrounded by those familiar animals. The growling of the dog, the hissing of the snake, the screaming of the monkey, and the booming crow of the rooster blended into a symphony of fear and awakening. That dream was a profound warning that inside each person are both good and evil parts, and only by facing and overcoming them can a person truly be pure and strong. The story of Poinacule was not only a tragedy of brutal punishment, but also a lesson about balance between sin and awareness, between chaos and order. Julia realized that to keep the sacred flame and protect Rome, she had to continuously fight not only external enemies, but also herself, with the snake, dog, monkey, and rooster hidden deep within her soul. Under the gloomy night of Rome, while the sacred flame in the Temple of Vesta still burned low, the screams and growls from the dreadful leather sack, Poinacule, echoed in Julia's mind. The brave Vestal Virgin, who had witnessed this terrifying punishment firsthand, not only understood its brutal power, but also deeply felt the psychological and social impact that Poinacule brought to the empire. In ancient Roman society, Poinacule was not simply a method of physical punishment. It was an extremely effective symbol of deterrence, a haunting warning sent to all who intended to commit especially serious crimes such as treason, killing within the family, or acts disrupting social order. When a person was locked in a leather sack with venomous snakes, fierce dogs, chaotic monkeys, and screaming roosters, it was not only a tragic end for them, but also a public spectacle, causing people to feel horror, fear, and vigilance. Julia understood that the terror created by Poinacule helped maintain social order in a vast and diverse empire like Rome. The condemned's screams, the snake's hisses, and other chaotic sounds not only made spectators tremble, but also planted in their minds a deep lesson about the consequences of breaking the law. However, Julia also realized a deeper meaning of this punishment. It symbolized the moral decay of the offender. Locked together with animals representing malice, betrayal, ignorance, and awakening, the criminal became a living image of disgrace and chaos, a reminder of the moral values threatened in society. Poinacule reflected a legal system both powerful and ruthless, where justice was not only punishment, but also a political tool to maintain power and control the people. Julia had witnessed many times how this punishment was used as a tool to suppress opposing forces or potential threats within the empire. The psychology of the Roman people under the influence of Poenacule is a mixture of fear and reverence for the law. Stories about Poenacule were passed down, becoming terrifying legends that everyone had to remember to avoid meeting a similar fate. For Julia, this punishment was a warning for herself, for the Vestal Virgins, and for the society she protected. It deeply engraved in her the determination to preserve tradition, maintain the sacred fire, and fight not only external enemies but also internal corruption. But does a punishment full of horror and cruelty like Poenacule really bring justice? Or is it just a symbol of power, fear, and oppression? Julia had to face this question in her deeply conflicted inner journey. Decimation, the mystery of the terrifying Roman military punishment, 1/10 must die to save thousands of lives. In the cold darkness of a Roman military tent, where the damp, musty smell of earth and sweat mingled, Julia, the brave Vestal Virgin who had faced many mysteries and terrifying punishments, now stood before a new truth. A different but no less horrifying punishment: decimation. Unlike punishments for common citizens or brutal penalties like Poenacule, decimation was a special punishment applied only in the Roman army. When a legion lost discipline, when there were signs of betrayal, cowardice, or chaos, just one collective offense could cost the lives of 1/10 of the soldiers. 1/10 of them would be randomly chosen to be executed right before their comrades. Julia heard from the old warriors in the city, those who had survived fierce battlefields, about this dreadful punishment. Decimation was not only a punishment, but also a display of power, a harsh warning to maintain order and the strength of the empire's mightiest army. The story began when a large Roman legion failed in an important battle, with clear signs of cowardice and loss of discipline. The generals and the emperor could not tolerate it and decided to apply decimation to purge the weaklings and restore faith among the troops. Julia, with her keen instincts and endless curiosity, was invited to witness the process, an event few had seen firsthand due to its cruelty and severity. She saw hundreds of soldiers standing in line, their faces a mixture of fear, hatred, and despair. 1/10 of them would be chosen, not based on individual actions, but completely randomly, like a cruel game of fate. The selection was done by dividing the soldiers into groups of 10, then forcing them to draw lots. The one who drew the lot had to receive the death sentence from his own comrades. The scene of a soldier having to kill his comrade under the horrified gaze of the others made Julia choke up. This was not just a punishment for individuals, but also a mental torment, to remind the entire group of the cost of betrayal and loss of discipline. Julia saw in the eyes of the surviving soldiers an inner chaos, an indescribable pain as they had to witness loss, yet continue to fight. Decimation did not only take lives, but left deep wounds in the army's soul, an expensive lesson to maintain unity and discipline. In Julia's mind, this punishment reflected a dark side of Roman power, relentless cruelty, the absolute priority of collective strength even at the cost of individuals. It also revealed the deep fear of the authorities before the collapse of order and combat effectiveness. Julia wondered whether this harshness really helped the legion become stronger or only created spiritual wounds difficult to heal, cracking trust and loyalty. She thought about herself, about the vows and sacrifices in the Temple of Vesta, and about the terrifying punishments she had witnessed. Every person in the empire was struggling with the harshest challenges, from soldiers on the battlefield to Vestal virgins in the shadows. Do you dare to step with Julia into the world of decimation, to feel the cruelty but also the contradictions of this punishment? Follow her 10 steps, her longing glances, to discover the secrets of an empire that once ruled the world, but was also full of untold darkness. Julia stood silently before the main tent, where in the next few hours, the lives of 1/10 of the soldiers would be ended by the hands of their own comrades. The stories about decimation she had heard now came vividly to life before her eyes. The punishment was not only death, but also an unforgettable lesson about loyalty and responsibility to the collective. Inside her rose an indescribable chaos, reverence for the power of the empire, but also sorrow for the heavy price paid. Julia's story continued, touching the deepest mysteries, the struggles between power, morality, and humanity in the great Roman history. Under the dim light of flickering torches in the night, Julia stood silently at the edge of the Roman camp, her heart pounding with fear and curiosity. She had heard much about the punishment of decimation, but had never had the chance to witness such extreme brutality firsthand. Tonight, she would see with her own eyes how the Roman Empire used this punishment to maintain order and discipline in the army, a harsher measure than anything she had ever experienced at the Temple of Vesta. Hundreds of soldiers stood in long rows, their eyes mixed with fear, anger, and despair. The generals stood nearby, faces cold as ice, ready to carry out the painful decision to select 1/10 of them to be punished for cowardice and loss of discipline in the recent battle. Julia felt the heavy atmosphere like a storm about to strike. The process of selecting the punished began by dividing soldiers into groups of 10. Each group had to perform a terrifying lottery ritual. Whoever drew death would suffer the punishment. Sighs, sobs, and panicked eyes spread throughout the ranks. Julia could not take her eyes off the trembling hands reaching into the container holding small pieces of paper, the paper with the death number or the lucky number. When a person was chosen, he was dragged out of the line, brought into public view, where everyone could witness the humiliation and cruelty about to unfold. Comrades, those who had shared trenches and dangers together, were now forced to become executioners, wielding weapons, beating, or directly ending the lives of their fellow soldiers. The harshness and sorrow of the scene made Julia choke back tears. There were screams of pain, desperate looks, and even tears of regret as the soldiers faced the horror, becoming killers with their own hands. Relentless blows, cold spears, and the deadly silence of the watching crowd created the ultimate tragic picture of loyalty and cruelty. Not only physical pain, the punished also suffered public humiliation. They were tied to poles, mocked, insulted by comrades and those around them. That shame not only killed the body, but also pierced deeply into the spirit, turning fear into an unforgettable lesson for the entire legion. Julia realized that decimation was not just a personal punishment, but a tool to control collective psychology. The horror of comrades' deaths and public disgrace made the remaining soldiers afraid, yet maintained discipline, the absolute loyalty to the Legion and the Empire. The cruelty of the punishment created an invisible barrier between order and chaos, between life and death. But deep in her soul, Julia felt infinite pain. She thought of those forced to kill their comrades, of young soldiers pushed into the whirlpool of fear and despair. Did that punishment really create strength? Or did it only cause deep wounds that would never heal within the army's heart? That night, as the screams and cries quieted down, Julia wondered, could she, with the sacred duty of keeping the holy fire, change these cruel shadows? Could there really be justice without the price of blood and humiliation like this? Julia's story continued, with unanswered secrets and endless struggles between power and humanity in the great Roman Empire. Under the gray sky of Rome, where the campfires flickered occasionally as a signal of an inevitable fate, Julia, the Vestal Virgin who had witnessed the harshest punishments, now stood before another truth, a spiritual cost that decimation had left to the great Roman army. Decimation, the brutal punishment designed to maintain iron discipline, had become a symbol both solemn and carrying deep scars in the soul of every soldier. Julia had seen survivors of decimation, their eyes no longer those of brave warriors, but filled with persistent confusion and fear. The punishment of decimation not only took the lives of 1/10 of the soldiers, but also sowed deep fear, an indelible obsession in every step and breath of the legion. The remaining soldiers were forced to witness the death of their comrades, and were compelled to kill those who had once fought alongside them, breaking all boundaries between camaraderie and survival. Julia clearly saw the fracture in the army's unity. Since decimation was enforced, many soldiers began to doubt, lose trust, and even show signs of panic during campaigns. The fear not only made them obey blindly, but also led to the loss of fighting spirit, the very soul of the Roman legion. But the Roman authorities, in their cruelty and pragmatism, saw decimation as a necessary tool to maintain strength and order, to extinguish any signs of weakness or betrayal. They knew that only by sowing extreme fear could they keep the ranks of soldiers from falling apart and becoming weak. Julia wondered about the fragile balance between severity and humanity in the empire. Decimation, marked by blood and tears, had etched a dark page in Roman military history, a terrifying combination of justice and brutality. It was both a warning to those who wanted to break order and a difficult wound to heal in the hearts of soldiers. Deep in her soul, Julia felt the contradiction of the punishment. It kept the legion strong in form, but profoundly weakened the spirit and loyalty. She knew that true strength lay not only in fear, but also in trust, cohesion, and courage. Julia's story continued to raise unanswered questions about how a mighty empire like Rome balanced power and humanity, discipline and cruelty. Would you dare follow her steps to explore the hidden corners and tragedies of decimation, to see more clearly the true price humans pay for greatness and power? Julia stood looking at the night sky, remembering the eyes of the surviving soldiers, eyes no longer bright with faith, but marked by pain, fear, and endless confusion. Decimation had not only killed the body, but left lasting spiritual wounds that no time could heal. Within her, the sacred flame burned endlessly, symbolizing steadfastness and sacrifice. But she understood that to truly protect Rome, it was not only the power of the sacred fire or the authority of law that was needed, but also empathy, compassion, and strong trust among people who shared the same purpose. The Tarpeian Rock, where Roman criminals were thrown down to pay for their crimes, a harsh light in the dark night of history. On the majestic Capitoline Hill of Rome stood a steep cliff called the Tarpeian Rock, towering like a cold witness to the harshest executions in Roman history. Julia, the Vestal Virgin who had stepped through many dark secrets of the empire, now stood silent before the horrifying spectacle of a public punishment she had never witnessed, the throwing of criminals down the Tarpeian Rock. This was not merely a punishment, it was a display of power, a final sentence for traitors, major criminals, or even those deemed dangerous to social order and government. Being thrown from the towering cliff not only ended life tragically, but also symbolized rejection, complete erasure from the world. Julia observed the preparations. The criminal was tightly bound, led through the square before a large crowd. Shouts, accusations, and scornful looks cut like sharp knives into the condemned. They were not only executed, but also pushed into the center of public humiliation, for everyone to witness and be warned. Soon, the person was brought to the edge of the cliff, where death awaited. A strong shove, their body fell freely into the dark abyss. Screams echoed, mingling with the rumbling sound of stone and cold wind, creating a mournful symphony haunting all who heard it. The horror of that moment was not only in the death, but also in the symbolic meaning. The one thrown down was no longer part of society. They were stripped of all dignity and discarded like worthless debris, unworthy of remembrance. This was a clear warning. There was no place for crime and betrayal in the great city of Rome. Julia felt a powerful vibration in her soul. The pain and injustice blended with the solemnity of the tradition she upheld. The Tarpeian Rock was not just the place where life ended, but also a symbol of the harshness of Roman law, of uncompromising power and the fear spreading through society. Through this punishment, Julia understood that the empire not only maintained order through laws, but also by making people forever remember its severity and cruelty. Each death at the cliff was a story, a lesson deeply engraved in the minds of millions, that betrayal would be paid for with a tragic end and permanent erasure. But deep inside, Julia also wondered, could justice exist without such cruelty? Could people live in a society where public death became a tool of control and domination? Those questions were like smoldering fires burning within her, challenging every value and tradition she once believed in. Would you dare to follow Julia's footsteps, to look straight into the darkness of history, to witness the brutality and the symbol of power of the Tarpeian Rock? Her story will take you deep into the dark days of Rome, where justice and cruelty fiercely battled on every cold stone. As the last scream of the one thrown down the Tarpeian Rock gradually faded, the crowd still stood silent. Terror and admiration mixed on every face. Julia, with a heavy heart, looked up to the hilltop where light and shadow met, a symbol of life and death, of power and injustice. She knew that the mission to keep the sacred flame was not only to protect a religious symbol, but also to stand amidst the whirlwind of power, morality, and survival. Every punishment, every public death was part of a bigger story, the story of an empire that was once mighty but also full of undeniable darkness. On the Capitoline Hill, the sacred heart of Rome, the Tarpeian Rock, stood towering like a cold witness to legendary tales, betrayal, and the harshest sentences of the empire. Julia, the brave Vestal virgin who had faced the harshest punishments, was now drawn into the mysterious story of the rock's name origin, the story of a girl named Tarpeia, a symbol of betrayal and harsh punishment in Roman history. Legend says Tarpeia was the daughter of one of Rome's most powerful military commanders, entrusted with protecting the fortress from the invasion of the Sabine tribe. However, contrary to the expectations of her parents and community, Tarpeia chose to betray her homeland out of greed and personal calculation. She sold the city gates to the enemy in exchange for golden bracelets, the symbol of wealth she always craved. But Tarpeia's betrayal was unforgiven. When she opened the city gates, the Sabines rushed in, and in the panic, they killed her by pushing her off the steep cliff, the rock now called the Tarpeian Rock. Tarpeia's tragic death became a symbol of the heavy price of betrayal. Julia felt the weight of the story standing by the cliff's edge, where for generations, countless souls had been thrown down as a final punishment. The Tarpeian Rock was not just a place, but a profound symbol of loyalty, betrayal, and the price of wrong choices in a harsh society. Through the legend of Tarpeia, Julia understood that every public punishment, from poena cullae to decimation, then to throwing criminals off the cliff, carried an unspoken message. The Roman Empire honored absolute loyalty and strictly punished every sign of decay and betrayal. The story of Tarpeia was also a profound warning to those living in the shadows of power, that greed and betrayal never brought happiness but only led to collapse and death. Julia, with her experiences and sacred mission, felt the close connection between the ancient legend and the present, between brutal punishments and the moral values preserved across generations. Would you dare to step with Julia into the world of bloody historical truth and harsh lessons? Follow her footsteps on Capitoline Hill, where every stone, every cliff tells a story of betrayal, punishment, and the undying faith of the Roman Empire. Darkness fell. The faint moonlight shone on the Tarpeian Rock, as if reminding today's generation of the ghosts of the past. Julia stood there, feeling the cold breath of history mingling with the mountain wind, a blend of light and shadow, life and death. In her heart, the sacred flame of the Vestal Temple still burned brightly, not only as a symbol of purity and sacrifice, but also as a reminder of the responsibility to preserve values and loyalty in a world full of temptations and trials. Are you ready to explore the darkest secrets, the untold stories of the Tarpeian Rock and the betrayer girl Tarpeia? Julia's journey will lead you through tense footsteps, echoes of the past, so you can feel the harshness, but also the power of a great empire. Under the gloomy sky of ancient Rome, where the sacred flame of the Temple of Vesta still flickered faintly, there was a place that was not only a massive cliff, but also a cold symbol of justice, punishment, and power, the Tarpeian Rock. Julia, a Vestal virgin who had witnessed the harshest punishments of the empire, now stood before that cliff, feeling more deeply than ever the cultural and social significance it held for Rome. The Tarpeian Rock was not merely the end for criminals thrown down to death. It symbolized severity, a harsh but necessary legal system to maintain social order in a vast and complex empire. For the Roman people, each time a criminal was thrown here, it was not only a personal punishment, but also a stern warning to anyone daring to oppose the law, daring to betray the city of Rome. Julia recalled the legend of Tarpeia, the betraying daughter who was thrown down the cliff, a symbol of the ruthless price of betrayal and greed. That story was not only a legend, but also the spiritual foundation for using the cliff as a tool for public punishment, emphasizing that betrayal was an unforgivable sin in Roman society. Public punishment at the Tarpeian Rock also reflected the cruelty and strictness in how Roman society maintained power. The public was invited to witness, educated through painful images of the consequences of sin, creating deep fear and deterrence. It was a way for the authorities to assert control and absolute authority, using brutality as a tool to maintain peace and order. Julia sensed the power of this symbol. It combined power, morality, and fear in a subtle way. Romans did not only fear death, but also feared disgrace and rejection from the community. which being thrown from the Tarpeian rock most clearly represented. However, within Julia arose deep reflections on the balance between justice and humanity. Could a society maintain order and power through such cruelty without losing its human essence? That was the question she carried as she silently looked down into the abyss where hundreds of lives had fallen throughout Rome's dark history. Would you dare to step into that world to experience with Julia the mysteries, contradictions, and power of the Tarpeian rock? Let's explore together the bloody but vivid lessons of a great empire that once ruled the ancient world, where justice and power were never separated. Julia turned and walked away, her heart heavy with thoughts. The sacred flame inside her still burned, but now that light had to blend with the darkness of historical truth. That to keep order, power, and justice, the Roman Empire had to pay with countless lives and unforgettable tragedies. Under the gloomy sky of ancient Rome, screams and cries mingled with the applause of the crowd gathered around the vast square. Julia, the Vestal Virgin who had witnessed countless cruel punishments, now stood at the edge of the crowd, her eyes thoughtfully following a special ritual, the ritual of transformation into mythical characters for those sentenced to death. This was not only a punishment, but also a tragic performance, a mythical play blending reality and supernatural elements, stunning and terrifying the entire city. The condemned were not simply criminals. They were forced to take on roles of characters in Roman mythology, gods, monsters, or cursed heroes, to symbolize the connection between their crimes and powerful, mysterious, supernatural images. Julia witnessed a criminal elaborately disguised, wearing masks and splendid yet haunting costumes, preparing to enter the final play of his life. The purpose was not only to increase drama and attract the crowd's attention, but also to emphasize the nature of sin, as a warning that transgressions brought not only worldly consequences, but were linked with supernatural powers and eternal curses. The transformation made death more tragic and heavy, capturing the audience's gaze, drawing them into a story both tragic and mythical. Julia felt the power of this ritual. It was both a punishment and a means of social education and control. Through the play, people were reminded of moral values, the severity of justice, and the connection between humans and gods. Each death was interpreted as a sacred story, making the crowd feel not only fear, but also respect and reverence. However, Julia also recognized a dark side of the ritual, the cruelty of turning tragic humans into living symbols, forcing them to endure physical and spiritual pain before the entire city. It was a double punishment, physical death and spiritual rejection, through the predetermined images in the play. Deep inside, Julia wondered if true justice could exist without such theatrics and humiliation. Could people feel empathy and compassion in a society where death was transformed into tragic plays, where humans were turned into symbols of pain and fear? Would you dare to follow Julia's steps, entering that mysterious yet contradictory world, to witness firsthand the power and cruelty of mythic embodiment rituals in Roman punishments? Her story would take you through every dramatic moment, every tragic scene, and every untold secret about power, crime, and salvation in the great empire. When the play ended and the condemned fell into the hands of death, the crowd shared not only the pain of loss, but also carried a profound lesson, that every action has unavoidable consequences, that Rome's justice was immutable and severe, yet full of divine power. Julia walked in the dim light of night, pondering her mission, not only to keep the sacred flame, but also to be a witness, a recorder of the tragic stories and sacrifices of humanity, to pass them on to future generations. That flame was not only a physical light, but also a symbol of faith, perseverance, and the strength to overcome the darkness of history. Night gradually fell over the great city of Rome, the firelight from torches sweeping across the faces of thousands gathered in the vast square. Julia, the Vestal Virgin who had endured many horrors and mysteries of the empire, stood silently at the edge, her eyes fixed on the imminent public execution, a spectacle that for the Romans was not only punishment for crime, but also a cold-blooded show serving social entertainment and control. The criminals were tightly bound, brought before the frenzied crowd, their eyes wild, full of fear and despair. But instead of being seen as victims of strict justice, they became characters in a cruel play where death was transformed into a bloody performance, attracting thousands of spectators. Julia clearly felt the moral corruption this public punishment had created in Roman society. The cheers, mockery, and glee of the crowd were like a mockery of justice, turning pain and death into a cruel amusement. Justice was no longer strict deterrence, but a ruthless form of entertainment, where human lives became scapegoats for the crowd's pleasure. In those terrifying moments, Julia saw not only brutality, but also the indifference and coldness of the witnesses, a society where another's death became a joke, where fear was exploited to the utmost to maintain power and social order. Public executions were not only punishments, but also psychological control tools, sowing deep fear, forcing absolute obedience to laws and power. But the price paid was corruption, the loss of humanity and moral values of an entire civilization. In her heart, Julia felt endless pain. She wondered if true justice could exist in a society where cruelty became a symbol of power. Could people keep compassion and fairness when death turned into a bloody game? Would you dare to enter that dark and contradictory world with Julia? To witness and feel the power and tragedy of an empire that once ruled the world, but was also turned into a death stage by power and cruelty itself? As night fell, Julia left the square, her mind full of thoughts and unanswered questions. The sacred flame within her still burned, but that light now mingled with the darkness of historical truth, that to keep power and order, Rome had to pay with moral corruption and bloody tragedies. Roman justice and the dark side of power when crime is measured by class. In the dim afternoon light atop Capitoline Hill, Julia stood by the cold stone wall, reflecting on what she had witnessed during her time as a Vestal Virgin. The Roman Empire, where the sacred fire still burned fiercely, where horrific punishments were publicly carried out, hid a terrifying truth. Justice was not the same for everyone. The story of class-based differences in criminal punishment gradually unfolded, leaving her shocked and restless. Julia had witnessed many times that when a commoner committed a crime, small or great, they were immediately exposed, subjected to the harshest public punishments. Some were thrown off the Tarpeian Rock, others faced the brutal poinacule, or decimation, in the army. These punishments were not only penalties, but also deterrents, warnings to the whole society that betrayal and breaking laws would be severely punished. But when criminals of noble or upper-class status appeared, the justice picture was entirely different. Julia recalled a classic case, a high-ranking official accused of corruption and betrayal of the empire. Instead of being publicly executed or facing harsh punishments, he was tried in a private court, allowed to use money and power to bribe influential people. The penalty was lighter, sometimes only temporary imprisonment and fines, a leniency that outraged common people. That difference lay not only in the punishment, but also in societal treatment. Nobles were shielded, protected by power and connections, while common people were always scapegoats for unjust power systems. Julia could not help but feel indignant, seeing many times that commoners had to endure cruelty while the wealthy and powerful escaped death sentences. She wondered, can justice truly be called fair when it is measured by money and status? Can a society be sustainable when inequality in the law fractures the trust of its people? These questions haunted Julia as she witnessed the growing divide between social classes. However, in Roman society, this inequality was an undeniable reality. It reflected a power system designed to maintain the interests of the upper class while controlling and manipulating the masses. Justice, therefore, became a political tool, a weapon used to consolidate power and maintain social order in the way those with vested interests desired. Julia realized that beyond the harsh and cruel punishments she had witnessed, there were hidden stories of corruption, conspiracies, and complicity for the crimes of the powerful and influential. It was a dark side that few dared to mention, yet it was an undeniable reality. Do you dare to step with Julia into that world, to explore the unseen corners of justice and power in the Roman Empire? Her journey will lead you through dramatic events, unexpected mysteries, and stories that change the way we view this great but complex history. As darkness fell over Rome, Julia stood there, her heart heavy with thoughts. The sacred flame within her still burned, but that light had to blend with the shadows of historical truth, that justice was not always fair, and power always sought to protect itself at any cost. Are you ready to face these bitter truths? Join Julia as she steps into the world of power, cruelty, and untold stories of Roman justice, where discrimination and injustice were inseparable links in history. Under the cool shade of ancient olive trees, where the whispers of the wind tell stories thousands of years old, Julia, the Vestal Virgin with a heart always stirred by Rome's tragedy, once again faced a harsh truth of Roman society. Corruption was not only found in bloody public punishments, but also in the favors granted by power to the upper class. One of those favors was the option of suicide, a shortcut given to noble offenders to preserve their dignity and family honor. Julia recalled the first time she heard of this, when a nobleman accused of treason and corruption was, instead of being publicly subjected to cruel punishments like commoners, allowed to choose suicide. This was not mercy, but a way Roman society protected the honor and prestige of the elite, sparing them public disgrace, humiliation, and painful moments before the crowd. To Julia, this was a dark side of Roman justice, where equality was erased by class distinctions, and death became a negotiation, a favor granted to the rich and powerful. Suicide was not only a release, but also a form of protection, so that reputation and name were not stained by the cruel images of execution. She imagined a noble standing before the final choice, to stab himself or be dragged through the square before the fearful eyes of the crowd. That choice, though painful, was a precious gift, allowing them to keep dignity in society's and posterity's eyes. Their families would not live in shame, and death was adorned with silence and nobility. But Julia could not help but see the human tragedy in that choice. Suicide as a favor was actually a tragedy, the forced ending of one's life to avoid physical pain and spiritual humiliation. It reflected a harsh society where honor and reputation were placed above life itself, where death was not only an end, but also a calculated final chapter of power. In her heart, Julia pondered whether anything could be changed in a system where discrimination and power ruled every aspect of life. She thought of the sacred flame she guarded. Could it be a symbol for a justice that was fair, without distinction of wealth, power, or lowliness? Do you dare to enter Julia's world where historical truths are both cruel and complex, to explore with her the untold stories of power, honor, and death in the Roman Empire? This journey will take you through the dark alleys of history, where life and death intertwine in a tragic and powerful dance. As the sun set behind the hills of Rome, Julia still stood there, reflecting on her mission and the dark secrets of the empire. The sacred flame still burned brightly, a reminder of steadfastness, sacrifice, and an undying faith. Are you ready to face those contradictions and bitter truths? Join Julia as she steps into a world where justice is not always fair, and where death, whether chosen or forced, always carries untold stories of power and honor. The faint sunset glow over ancient Rome, where the red rooftops burn bright in the evening sun, Julia stood silently watching the passing crowd, her heart heavy with thoughts about a dark aspect few dare face: the suicide order for the nobility, a form both of favor and the harshest psychological burden in Roman society. For common people, death decreed by law is a clear end, though brutal. But for the upper class, those with power, honor, and great responsibility, death carries a far more complex meaning. Julia had witnessed times when nobles were forced to choose between life and the suicide order, a tragic paradox hidden behind a veil of honor and tradition. The suicide order was not merely a punishment. It was a tool to maintain a sophisticated social order, preserving the family's honor and dignity before the public. It was a compulsory choice, placing a terrifying psychological pressure on the noble, to live or die, but either way, it was an immeasurable loss. Julia pictured a noble, once a symbol of strength and power, now facing a bitter choice. An intense internal battle between the will to live and the responsibility to protect reputation. Social pressure, family expectations, and unspoken rules in Roman society formed an invisible wall weighing heavily on their minds, making the suicide order an inevitable part of their personal tragedy. Many times, Julia heard rumors of those choosing suicide as a way to cleanse their sins, an act leaving a mark in history and earning respect from future generations. But behind these glamorous stories lay painful shadows: loneliness, despair, and the feeling of being silently abandoned. The complexity of Roman concepts of honor and justice is clearly reflected in this form. Honor was not only praise, but also a heavy responsibility. Justice was not only law, but also a power game, where life and death were controlled by unwritten rules everyone understood. Julia wondered if true justice could exist in a society where death was chosen as a means to maintain power and honor. Did such corruption and favors really bring fairness, or only mask cruelty and injustice? Would you dare follow Julia, delving deep into the souls of those powerful people, uncover the truth about pressure, tragedy, and harsh choices in the Roman Empire? Her story will lead you through heavy footsteps, restless long nights, and moments confronting the harshest truths of history. As night fell over Rome, Julia still stood there, the sacred flame within her never extinguishing, a symbol of steadfastness, sacrifice, and courage. But she knew that to keep those values in a society full of contradictions and tragedies like Rome, one needed not only strength, but also deep understanding and compassion. Are you ready to face those bitter challenges and truths with Julia? Step into the world of power, honor, and death in the greatest empire of human history, where life and death always intertwine in a sorrowful dance without end. The sky turned fiery red as sunset fell over Rome. Screams and mocking laughter echoed through the squares, blending into a chilling chorus that tightened Julia's heart. The Vestal Virgin who had endured countless tragedies. The spectacle was not a play, but public humiliations, horrific tools used by Roman society to degrade the dignity and honor of criminals, especially rebels who insulted power. Julia had witnessed chilling scenes, criminals branded hot irons on their cheeks or foreheads, a permanent mark not only on flesh but also on the soul. It was not only physical punishment but social demotion, an indelible sentence of guilt and shame. People would see them and immediately know their dark past, a public, unforgiving verdict. Not only branding, Julia had also seen more painful punishments. Rebels having their tongues cut out, a symbol of silence, of stripping away the right to speak, to express, and to defend oneself. This punishment not only caused terrible pain, but turned them into living images of rejection and isolation. Public humiliations also included being tied to posts, chased and beaten in public, labeled with disgraceful crimes, and harassed and shunned by citizens. Julia understood these were not merely personal punishments, but part of a social control strategy, creating deep fear and deterrence. Through her experiences, Julia realized that humiliations aimed not only to destroy the body, but also served as spiritual tools to break willpower, making criminals lose all faith and hope, isolated from the community. It was a comprehensive attack, making their return to normal life impossible. Yet, Julia also sensed a paradox. Within these cruel punishments existed a belief that honor and dignity could be destroyed through material marks and pain. This was how Roman society maintained power and order, by turning violators into outcasts, not only legally, but also in the minds of the community. She wondered if one day justice could be served without brutal punishments and public humiliation. Could humanity learn to forgive and respect dignity even for those who have made mistakes? Do you dare to follow Julia, deeply experiencing the bloody yet humane hidden corners of ancient Roman society? Join her as she steps into a world where justice and power constantly clash, where each punishment is not only a lesson but also a story about humanity, honor, and survival. As night fell over Rome, Julia still stood there, the sacred fire within her unextinguished. That light symbolized steadfastness, courage, and sacrifice, but also reminded of the darkness and tragedies that history cannot deny. Are you ready to enter that world full of contradictions, to explore with Julia untold stories of power, cruelty, and dignity in the greatest empire of the ancient world? This is not just a story of punishment, but an epic of resilience and compassion between darkness and light. Under the gloomy, dark sky of ancient Rome, where the sacred fire still burned faintly in the Temple of Vesta, Julia, the Vestal Virgin who had witnessed the harshest sufferings and punishments of the empire, now faced a bitter reality. Roman power not only punished bodies, but also censored and silenced dissent with the most horrific penalties. One of the harshest and most terrifying punishments she had ever seen was tongue cutting, a way to silence slanderers, to extinguish evil words that could shake power and social order. Julia recalled the first time she witnessed this punishment. A man accused of spreading words against the emperor and authority was brought before a crowd. He was not only tightly bound, but also prepared for a special ritual, tongue cutting. This act was not merely a physical punishment, but a declaration of power. Cutting off the tongue, the only tool to convey ideas, to resist and express, was to make the offender silent forever. In that moment, Julia felt the extreme cruelty of Roman law, where not only the body, but also words and ideas were controlled by violence. The purpose was not only to punish an individual, but also to extinguish any voice that might threaten social stability and current power. Tongue-cutting punishment was the clearest symbol of censorship, an act that deprived freedom of speech and at the same time warned others. Julia saw clearly that fear came not only from death or physical punishment, but also from losing the right to speak, to be heard, losing the most essential part of personality and individuality. This punitive censorship also reflected a society where power was consolidated by enforced silence, where all criticism or resistance was strangled by the cruelest measures. Julia wondered if true justice could exist when human voices were regarded as threats and had to be silenced by blood and pain. Do you dare to step into that world, where power and control lie not only on battlefields or temples, but also in every word, every breath of people? Julia will lead you through cold footsteps, muffled sounds, and shadows that few dare face in Roman history. As darkness fell over Rome, Julia still stood there, her heart full of thoughts about power, justice, and control. The sacred fire still burned brightly, but that light was also shadowed by harsh punishments and untold tragedies. Are you ready to confront the bitter truth about power and censorship in a great empire? Join Julia on a journey deep into history where justice and cruelty go hand in hand, and human voices are sometimes turned into eternal silence. Under the gray sky of ancient Rome, where weak sunlight barely illuminated silent figures walking through stone streets, Julia stood silently, her eyes full of sorrow looking toward the square where a crowd gathered. It was no ordinary ceremony, but a cruel spectacle. Public humiliations that Roman society used to warn, maintain order, and protect power and personal honor, even at the cost of cruelty and unspeakable pain. Julia, the Vestal Virgin, who always kept the city's sacred fire, had now witnessed more than she ever imagined about the dark nature of Roman justice. Humiliating punishments, like branding faces, tongue-cutting, public binding, or being chased and shamed by crowds, were not only physical penalties, but also extremely effective psychological weapons. They sowed fear, shame, and disintegration, breaking all spirit of resistance and will to rebel. Julia had witnessed the desperate eyes of those branded, carrying permanent marks of guilt and shame. She heard the painful screams when a rebel's tongue was cut off, losing the ability to speak, becoming a symbol of enforced silence. She felt the terrifying power of public humiliation. It was not only physical harm, but mental torture, humiliating a person to the utmost degree. Those punishments were carried out in public, witnessed by crowds, becoming a horrifying spectacle that everyone was drawn into, not merely for entertainment, but to remember the lesson of uncompromising punishment for those who opposed order and power. The crowd cheered, cursed, even participated in the torment, turning others' pain into dark pleasure. Julia noticed that in Roman society, these humiliating punishments reflected a cruel legal and social system where power was defended not only by weapons, but also by fear and the destruction of dignity. They served as tools to prevent all threats, from betrayal and rebellion to slander, helping maintain a social order based on strictness and intolerance. However, Julia could not help but feel sorrow for those punished. They lost not only freedom or life, but were also rejected by society, stripped of character and honor. It was a double punishment, both physical and spiritual, deeply wounded, trapped in a hopeless spiral with no escape. She wondered if a society could exist where justice was enforced without humiliation and cruelty. Could people live in peace and order when fear and destruction of dignity were the main tools of control? Would you dare enter that contradictory and tragic world with Julia to witness firsthand the cruelty yet power of public humiliations? Join her to experience dramatic moments, silent pains, and unforgettable lessons from ancient Roman history. As night fell over Rome, Julia left the square, her heart heavy with thought. The sacred flame still burned, a symbol of steadfastness, sacrifice, and faith. But that light had to blend with the darkness of historical truth. that to keep order and power, the Roman Empire had to pay with cruelty and painful tragedies. Are you ready to face this bitter truth? Walk with Julia on the deepest journey exploring power, justice, and dignity in the greatest empire of the ancient world. In the crimson light of the setting sun, Rome buzzed like never before as crowds gathered in the square to witness a special spectacle. Not a festival or victory, but the brutal scene of public humiliating punishments. Julia, the Vestal Virgin who had seen countless tragedies and sacred rites, now stood silent before the harsh reality of the society she protected. Branding, the most classic punishment, was both physically painful and left a permanent mark on the offender's body. Julia witnessed a rebel forced to lie down, his face glowing red under the hot iron blade, the burnt scar etched into his flesh like an irremovable report card of guilt. It was not only punishment, but a way to degrade dignity and strip honor before everyone. Moreover, the tongue-cutting punishment was applied to those considered slanderers, or who could not keep silent or opposed authority. The tongue, the only tool for expressing thought, emotion, and voice, was severed, rendering them permanently mute. Julia heard the painful screams and felt the horror spreading in the air as people witnessed this scene. Other humiliating punishments were also carried out publicly, such as being tied to a pole in the square, mocked by the crowd, beaten, or forced to wear shameful signs like tattered clothes or banners declaring their crimes. Julia realized these punishments aimed not only to punish individuals, but also served as public deterrents to ensure strict law compliance. Such public humiliations reflected the ruthlessness and severity with which Roman society maintained power and order. It used fear and shame to control behavior, turning justice into a brutal game where the weak were always victims. Julia felt her heart heavy, seeing those once heroes now pushed into the mire of humiliation and despair. Yet deep inside, Julia also saw light, the resilience and courage of those who maintained dignity despite being torn apart by these punishments. These were untold stories of inner strength and faith in justice, even if that justice was sometimes cruel and unreasonable. Do you dare to step into this world full of contradictions and sorrow with Julia? Join her to experience the most dramatic moments, the weighty scenes, and the deepest lessons about justice, power, and dignity in the great Roman Empire. As night falls over Rome, Julia still stands there, the sacred flame within her never extinguishing, a symbol of steadfastness, sacrifice, and compassion. Yet that light must mingle with the shadows of history, that to maintain order and power, Rome paid the price with cruelty and painful tragedies. Are you ready to face this bitter truth? Walk with Julia on the deepest journey to explore power, justice, and dignity in a society full of contradictions and tragedy. Under the fiery red sky of ancient Rome's sunset, the noisy crowd's voices mixed with angry shouts echo throughout the square. Julia, the Vestal Virgin tasked with guarding the city's sacred flame, stood silently on the edge, her eyes heavy with sorrow as she witnessed a cruel ritual, the punishment of tongue-cutting for those who slandered and defied authority. This was not merely a physical punishment, but a profound symbol of censorship and silencing in Roman society, a tool of power to maintain order and crush all dissenting voices. Julia had heard stories about those condemned for speaking ill of the emperor, those who spread words against the state or defamed the nobility. They were not only imprisoned or beaten, but also stripped of the most important human tool, the tongue, so they could no longer speak. Tongue-cutting was not just bodily punishment, but eternal silencing, a way for power to completely control speech and ideas within society. Julia witnessed the terrified eyes and indescribable pain of the punished. The feeling of losing the ability to express, the right to speak truth or defend oneself, was a spiritual devastation deeper than any physical penalty. The forced silence became a warning lesson for all who dared oppose or mock power. The punishment of tongue-cutting was also a powerful symbol of controlling information and thought in Roman society. It showed that the authorities feared not only rebellious actions, but also words that could shake power and social order. By extinguishing dissenting voices, they protected their dominance through fear and strict censorship. Julia realized that in Roman society, power did not only lie in swords or weapons, but in controlling speech and information. The cruelty of this punishment reflected a system intolerant of diverse opinions, a society where enforced silence was a means to maintain stability. However, deep inside, Julia also felt the complexity and sorrow of those punished. They lost not only their tongues, but also their voices in society, losing dignity and faith. It was a prolonged spiritual death, an unbridgeable isolation. Do you dare enter that world where power and censorship constantly clash in every word, every breath? Walk with Julia through tense moments, silent pains, and untold lessons about censorship and silencing in ancient Rome. When night fell over Rome, Julia still stood there, the sacred flame within her unextinguished, a symbol of steadfastness and courage. But that light was also overshadowed by the darkness of historical truth, that to protect power and order, Rome did not hesitate to use cruelty and censorship as tools to control every voice. Are you ready to face this bitter truth? Join Julia on a deep journey exploring power, censorship, and silence in a society full of contradictions and sorrow. In the vast space of the Roman Forum, under the blazing midday sun, Julia, the Vestal Virgin keeper of the sacred flame in the temple of Vesta, stood silently witnessing an unforgettable scene. Public humiliations cruelly but effectively carried out. These were not mere punishments, but profound deterrents, used to maintain social order by degrading the dignity and honor of those deemed threats to power and stability. Julia had witnessed criminals branded with hot irons on their faces, a permanent mark impossible to erase, so anyone who saw would know their dark past. She had seen rebels have their tongues cut off of their right to speak, turning them into mute ghosts among the crowd. Not only that, other humiliations, such as being bound in the square, insulted, cursed, or forced to carry banners listing their crimes, also made people feel the immense power of public shame and disgrace. These punishments aimed not only to destroy the body, but also to attack the soul, breaking the will and shattering all beliefs of the offender. Julia realized that in Roman society, public humiliation became one of the most powerful weapons of power to control and regulate behavior, protecting centralized authority and the immutability of social order. The scene of the crowd cheering, mocking, and unleashing anger on the offenders made Julia shudder. Physical pain seemed small compared to the spiritual pain of being rejected by one's own people, stripped of dignity before everyone's eyes. That cruelty not only created deterrence, but also planted persistent fear in people's hearts, making anyone think twice before challenging the law. However, Julia also saw the complexity of this phenomenon. The punishments of public humiliation reflected a society that was not only brutal, but also highly attentive to personal honor and community cohesion. It was a control system based on a combination of fear, shame, and social responsibility. When a person was humiliated, not only did they suffer, but their family and lineage were also affected, creating enormous social pressure to maintain stability. Julia wondered whether a society could endure if justice was maintained through such cruelty and humiliation. Could those who remained live in peace when power was reinforced by such psychological torture? And was there any way to change a system so deeply ingrained in tradition and consciousness? Do you dare to enter this dark but truthful world with Julia? Join her in experiencing tense moments, weighty scenes, and the deepest lessons about justice, power, and dignity in ancient Roman society. As night fell over Rome, Julia left the square, her heart heavy with thoughts about history, justice, and cruelty. The sacred flame still burned brightly within her, symbolizing perseverance, sacrifice, and unwavering faith, but also a reminder of the shadows never forgotten. Are you ready to face that bitter truth? Walk with Julia on a profound journey exploring power, justice, and dignity in a society full of contradictions and tragedy. The sky over Rome was clear, but the square held an atmosphere so suffocating it was hard to breathe. Julia, the steadfast Vestal Virgin who had witnessed countless horrific punishments, now stood frozen before a gruesome scene, a painful and cruel ritual of burning alive. The victim was forced to wear an oil-soaked tunic, highly flammable, then burned alive before thousands of witnesses. This was not only a physical punishment, but also a powerful symbol of justice, punishment, and fear spread throughout the empire. Julia recalled bloody stories about the deadly tunic, an instrument used by Roman judges and leaders to end the lives of serious offenders such as traitors, witches, or enemies of the empire. The tunic, soaked in oil and easily ignited, when worn by the condemned, became a living coffin where fire and smoke not only burned the body but also consumed every bit of life in their soul. The ritual of burning alive was not merely the end of life. It carried a deep symbolic meaning. The sacred fire as a way to purify sins, burn away all stains, and renew society from dangerous elements. But for Julia, that light could not hide the darkness of pain, humiliation, and the tragedy of people pushed into despair. She saw the victims' terrified eyes as the flames rose, the painful screams echoing throughout the square, followed by the crowd's fearful silence. Those final moments were like a fiery indictment of the crimes committed, but also a reminder of the cruelty and severity of Roman justice. Julia wondered if a society could exist where punishment was burned to such extremes without losing humanity and compassion. Her sacred flame, a symbol of purity and sacrifice, suddenly conflicted with the fire that mercilessly consumed human beings. Do you dare to enter that world to witness and deeply feel the power, cruelty, and meaning of the burning punishment in the oil-soaked tunic with Julia? Her story will take you through the most dramatic, thrilling, and haunting moments of Roman history, where life and death merged into an unforgettable, tragic dance. As night fell on Rome, Julia stood there, heart heavy with thought and faith. The sacred flame inside her still burned brightly, a reminder of steadfastness, sacrifice, and undying faith, but also proof of the darkness and tragedies history's empire could never retreat from. Are you ready to face those horrific challenges? Walk with Julia on a profound journey exploring power, justice, and cruelty in a society that once shook the ancient world. The sky of Rome glowed red under the sunset, the weak light reflecting on the tunic, not merely clothing, but a tool of pain, deprivation, and control over human rights in ancient Roman society. Julia, the brave and sensitive Vestal Virgin, had witnessed many burnings of criminals in the oil-soaked tunic. But now she began to realize that the tunic held a much deeper meaning than its dazzling appearance. The tunic, a common garment familiar to all social classes in Roman society, was transformed in this case into a symbol of imprisonment. When the offender was forced to wear it, the tunic was not only their final garment, but also a living coffin, trapping them in fire and cruelty. Julia recognized that the tunic represented the deprivation of human rights, not only physically, but also spiritually, symbolizing loss of freedom and total control of power over the individual. This tunic was more than just a garment. It was a tool to turn punishment into a haunting public spectacle. Those burned alive in the oil-soaked tunic not only died in agony, but also endured humiliation and the gaze of thousands of eager eyes. This was how Roman society used punishment as a psychological control device, sowing fear and serving as a warning to the entire populace. Julia deeply felt the symbolism of the tunic. It was not simply a piece of clothing soaked in oil, but an outer shell that imprisoned and suffocated every right to live, to speak out, and to exist. The tunic was proof of the cruelty of a system where justice and brutality merged into bloody performances meant to consolidate power. Looking into the terrified eyes of those condemned and dressed in the tunic, Julia saw despair and helplessness, but also a silent resistance in each final breath. The tunic could imprison the body, but could not imprison the soul and will of a person, something she understood better than anyone in her role as a Vestal Virgin. Do you dare to enter that dark yet honest world alongside Julia? Join her in exploring every layer of meaning, every story behind the tunic, from a common garment to a symbol of cruelty and power in a society that shaped human history with both light and shadow. As night fell over Rome, Julia stood by the Tiber River, her eyes distant, looking up at the starry sky. The sacred flame still burned, a reminder of steadfastness and sacrifice, but also a symbol of the darkness and tragedies that would never fade from the empire's history. Are you ready to face those truths? Walk with Julia on the deepest journey into power, dignity, and control in ancient Roman society. The sky over Rome glowed red with firelight, its glow casting across the faces of the crowd standing along both sides of the square. Julia, the Vestal Virgin, loyal to the mission of guarding the sacred flame of the Temple of Vesta, stood there with a heavy heart witnessing a public punishment, the burning alive of a criminal in an oil-soaked tunic. This was not just a physical punishment, but a vivid symbol of cruelty, power, and control in ancient Roman society. Julia had heard many rumors about the horror of these burning rituals, but seeing it with her own eyes, she truly understood the deterrent power it held. The flames did not just consume the body, but also burned away false beliefs, betrayal, and sin, leaving the crowd unable to look away, haunted by the pain and death unfolding before them. This public punishment had a clear purpose: to deter the community, creating a terrifying scene that made anyone think twice before committing crimes. The agonized screams of the burned, the desperate eyes, and the distortion of the body in flames became the most vivid lesson on the consequences of wrongdoing. Julia realized that through this public burning ritual, Roman power not only punished but also displayed strength, reinforcing domination by spreading fear throughout society. It was a way to protect order and authority through cruelty, forcing everyone to obediently follow the law. However, Julia could not help but reflect on the deep psychological impact on both the punished and the witnessing crowd. The victim died in physical agony, but was also tormented mentally, while those who watched carried lasting fear and haunting images that could influence how they viewed power and justice for a long time. Julia wondered if there could be true justice when punishment was used as a bloody public spectacle where dignity and compassion were forgotten. Could a society sustainably develop when power was maintained by fear and violence? Do you dare to step into this bloody and contradictory world with Julia? Experience with her the tense moments, untold stories, and valuable lessons about power, justice, and cruelty in Roman history. As night descended, Julia still stood there, the sacred flame inside her never extinguishing, a symbol of steadfastness and courage. But that light was also shrouded by the darkness of tragedies that never faded from the empire's history. Are you ready to face this bitter truth? Join Julia on the deepest journey exploring power, justice, and cruelty in a society full of contradictions and sorrow. Under the blazing sun of Rome, the ancient stones silently witnessed countless events and secrets. Julia, the Vestal Virgin with a steadfast heart and penetrating eyes, had endured many harsh punishments, bloody rituals, and sorrows of the most powerful empire in history. But she had never felt such coldness and severity as when she heard about a unique punishment, damnatio memoriae, the curse of memory erasure. Julia was told about damnatio memoriae as an unparalleled punishment, not ending life with blood and fire, but completely erasing a person's existence from history, culture, and everyone's memory. The offender was not only deprived of their body, but also robbed of their identity, name, image, and every trace on earth and in human minds. It was a spiritual death sentence, a permanent and irreversible destruction. In Roman society, damnatio memoriae was the state's deepest form of revenge against traitors, failed leaders, or figures harmful to power and order. Julia had read about erased records, destroyed monuments, and names vanished from chronicles, as if they had never existed. The meaning of damnatio memoriae lay not only in erasing the past, but also served as a warning to anyone daring to oppose Roman authority. Betrayal was paid not only by death, but also by total oblivion, a loss greater than physical death. Julia imagined those subjected to damnatio memoriae as ghosts wandering history, forgotten and isolated forever. No one dared speak their names. No traces remained. They were as if they never lived or accomplished anything. This was the harshest punishment, touching the very essence of human existence. Deep inside Julia, the cruelty of damnatio memoriae stirred profoundly. She wondered if justice could exist when a person's presence was utterly denied this way. Was memory not part of the soul, the true existence of a person? And when memory was erased, did a person truly still live? Would you dare to step with Julia into this cold and ruthless world? Follow her through the darkest corners of Roman history, where existence and oblivion endlessly battled in a war lasting millennia, the war among power, justice, and memory. As night fell over Rome, Julia stood by the Tiber River, her gaze distant toward the horizon where light and shadow merged. The sacred flame still burned, a symbol of steadfastness and courage, but also a reminder of historical wounds that never healed. Are you ready to face the darkest secrets and the bitterest truths? Join Julia on the deepest journey to explore damnatio memoriae, the most brutal curse of the Roman Empire and humanity. Julia, the Vestal Virgin keeper of the sacred fire in the Temple of Vesta, had passed through countless painful stories and terrifying punishments of the Roman Empire. But this time, witnessing firsthand the process of memory erasure, damnatio memoriae, a punishment leaving no mark on the body but wiping a person completely from history, she truly felt the ultimate cruelty and harshness of power. Damnatio memoriae was not merely a curse, but a public, meticulous, and organized process. Julia observed every step of it, from statues of the offender being destroyed to their names being erased from tombstones and archives. Every trace, every image related to that person was wiped clean, as if they had never existed in this world. She saw stone workers carefully removing or breaking precious statues, chroniclers ordered to erase names from records, and even ordinary people forbidden from mentioning the person's name in daily life. Their names disappeared from all conversations, rituals, and even people's minds. Julia felt the terrifying power of memory erasure. This punishment did not only kill the body, but also the spirit and social existence. Anyone subjected to damnatio memoriae became a ghost, imprisoned in eternal oblivion, not allowed a place in history or in the hearts of people. This process was not only a way to punish individuals, but also a tool to consolidate power and maintain order. By wiping out the existence of traitors or disloyal individuals, the Roman Empire sent a clear message. Absolute power and total control over history and memory were unshakable. Julia wondered about the tragedy of those punished in this way. They did not die from physical pain like other punishments, but spiritual death was an endless torture. Forgotten, cast out from collective memory, they became the loneliest figures in human history. Would you dare to enter the world of damnatio memoriae with Julia to better understand the process and deep meaning of this punishment? Follow her through the dark corridors of history, where life and death are not only matters of the body, but also an unrelenting battle in the mind and memory of mankind. As night fell over Rome, Julia stood silently watching the Tiber River flow quietly. The sacred flame within her still burned, a symbol of steadfastness and courage, but also a reminder of the shadows and historical wounds that never fade. Are you ready to face the bitter truth and mysteries of damnatio memoriae? Join Julia on the deepest journey of discovery about power, justice, and existence in ancient Roman society. The last rays of sunlight fell upon the cold stone streets of Rome, where once echoed the footsteps of mighty warriors and solemn vows in the Temple of Vesta. Julia, a brave and sensitive Vestal virgin, had witnessed countless harsh punishments in the empire's history, but never had she felt such deep and complex cruelty as damnatio memoriae, a punishment that not only ended life, but completely erased the psychological and cultural existence of a person. Damnatio memoriae was not merely physical death, but expulsion from history, from the memory of humanity. It was a curse deeper than any execution, denying presence, destroying the name and image of the offender in all texts, monuments, tombstones, and in society's mind. People were not only killed but erased, becoming ghosts in collective memory. Julia sensed that damnatio memoriae was the cruelest punishment not because it prolonged physical suffering, but because it took away the right to be remembered, the right to exist in human memory, the most precious thing for anyone. That punishment shattered all bonds between the individual and society, turning the victim into an invisible being, unmentionable and unrememberable. In Roman society, damnatio memoriae was also a stern warning to the community. It was the empire's way of sending the message. Any act of betrayal or serious crime was punished not only by death, but also by erasure from all memory and social existence. It was an extremely effective psychological and cultural control measure, spreading fear and reinforcing the order of power. Julia reflected on the harshness and complexity of this punishment. It was not only meant to destroy individuals, but also how society confronted decay and betrayal, making damnatio memoriae a unique yet brutal ritual. It was both death and erasure, punishment and warning, creating a nightmare in Roman history. Would you dare to step into that cold and ruthless world with Julia? Follow her to explore the deepest shadows of damnatio memoriae, the eternal curse for those who opposed the empire, an unshakable symbol of Roman power and justice. As night fell over Rome, Julia stood silently watching the star-filled sky, the sacred flame still burning within her as a symbol of steadfastness, sacrifice, and courage. But that light was also covered by the darkness of cruelty and unforgettable tragedies in history. Are you ready to face the bitter truth and mysteries behind Damnatio Memoriae? Join Julia on the deepest journey of discovery about power, justice, and existence in ancient Roman society.